bro, we're just talking about how people feel in their everyday lives. Well, there's not a stat for that, so we just can't know. If somebody else doesn't tell me the right answer, then how can we possibly know? All right, welcome back to the party, everybody. This is Morty, and I am your host, Lutch, aka the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. Let's party. So there has been a lot of talk about the chemical differences in our brains between liberals and conservatives, and there's always a lot of pop psychology about what is really going on. So Lauren Southern did this a little bit more of a deep dive on this and citing, real science. And let's find out who is happier, liberals or conservatives.
Okay, so for the sake of intellectual responsibility, I do want to note, make a few caveats here before diving into the data. All data is just that, data. The information in this report is very well analyzed, but book reports and stats on anything are not a guide for life or a one-to-one comparison to reality. Many of you know I am a reality supremacist. I think it is incredibly stupid when people don't believe the things they see around them unless a peer-reviewed paper tells
The meme, it's raining today with the raindrops coming down. It's source. I always say that if you have not brought an alternative source to something that somebody is saying, then you don't have the right to ask them for a source. If you're just having a conversation with somebody, not everything that everybody knows, the source of which is, planted right at the front of their brain. Just because you can't quote the source right off the top of your head doesn't mean it's wrong, which is exactly what this meme is saying. I mean, come on.
them to, or vice versa. They reject things around them because it doesn't line up with the data they saw online. Nothing will ever be more cringeworthy to watch than when you're talking to a real person in front of you telling you about their life and you just swat away their entire lived experience as not worth your consideration because, well, they're the exception to some stat you saw online.
Yeah, shout out to Anirudh, if you guys remember him, somebody who was on the channel a lot in the early days, but kind of couldn't hack it because everything that he had to say was, well, this stat says that, and that says, and like, bro, we're just talking about how people feel in their everyday lives. And well, there's not a stat for that, so we just can't know. If somebody else doesn't tell me the right answer, then how can we possibly know? Like the level to which these people need an authority to tell them what they can see with their own eyes is crazy.
It is simply impossible for researchers to encapsulate all the complexities of the human experience into simple boxes.
Exactly.
And you will have a lot of trouble navigating the world if you think numbers explain it all. That being said, studies still offer us interesting insights to further our understanding of the real world, especially when there seems to be some parallels there. And I do think that's the case with the analysis I'm about to go through today, so let's jump right into it. It has been observed for ages in data that there is a consistent happiness and meaning gap between liberals and conservatives.
So she's just showing some charts here, and it's basically, saying Republicans happier over the years. So it's a percentage of happiness based on and over time, and consistently, we can see going back to 1972 that, except for in the late 70s, and that's about it. That Republicans always have seemed to self-report that they're happier. So when it comes to self-reporting, you gotta, be a little bit skeptical because, people are gonna talk about what they want to talk about, and it doesn't necessarily comport with reality. But that's why you want a sample size that has enough people that you get a legitimate chart.
Particularly, one study highlighted in this piece shows a significant uptick in depression amongst liberal teens in 2012.
Wow.
And 3 years later, a similar spike in conservative teens. That eventually tapered out while liberals continued on their depression train.
But look at the difference. Look at the difference between the higher it is, the more depressed you are. And so the blue line here and the red line here is the conservatives. The blue line is the liberals. And what is so it's just a score here. So this is some type of metric that they've devised. But still, by any metric, that is alarming.
Well, the author of the American Affairs piece has a theory that woke culture caused this uptick. That still didn't answer the question of why, in general, liberals are less happy even before this. So the authors started asking, why are conservatives more happy? One simple answer was that patriotism, family, marriage, and religiosity are more conservative values and are all linked to higher levels of happiness. And a lot of people I know would say, well, of course, it's things like the God factor, that connection to a higher power and purpose.
So if you're first time here, know that I am an atheist, and I am very strongly against dogmatic thinking. In the same way that leftist men can think that a male can turn into a female, on the right, there is dogmatic thinking that we just call religion. Just because I am an atheist does not mean that I don't believe in something bigger than myself. That's a conversation for another day, but please be aware that that aspect of the God component doesn't have to be specifically Yahweh or Allah or anything like that.
That gives conservatives a higher mood in general. But apparently that is not actually the case here, as independent of religious beliefs, even when measured on actual church attendance, liberals still were roughly twice as likely to report mental illness as conservatives.
So even the liberals who go to church are still more depressed than the Republicans who go to church.
So a lot of researchers decided to start looking at this from different angles and thought, what if we looked at this the other way around? Perhaps this is the result of a chicken and the egg problem. It isn't conservatism that's making these people happy. It's the happiness that's making them conservative. Of course, conservatives want to conserve the current world order because it benefits the positions they were born into. It respects wealth, family values, conventional attractiveness, all things that conservatives on average are more likely to fall into. They're literally more likely to be attractive than liberals based on data. Whereas perhaps if they were born with a different set of cards, they'd have a perspective shift there. And the reason they can't see the other perspective is because they don't want to admit that their conservatism comes from the result of systemic privilege. It's a good theory. However, it kind of falls flat when you consider the fact that ethnic minorities and immigrants, who tend to lean a bit more conservative, are also significantly less likely to be diagnosed with depression compared to their white liberal peers, despite being poorer on average.
Well, I guess it's not just systemic racism then. I guess it's not the evil white racism that's making all the liberals depressed and the conservatives so happy. Really quick, guys, I just want to ask you if you are enjoying the content and you want more, every single day we are in the Discord server. It is free to join. There's a link in the bio. Check that out. It's also in the pinned comment. Check that out. We are there every day. And after every live stream that I do every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, we go right over there so we can all talk. And it's not just like a chat thing. You're in a voice channel. You can cam up. You don't have to cam up, but we hang out and it is a really, really good time. So come on over and check it out.
Not only this, but the wealthier and more educated a liberal is, the more likely they are to be depressed. So what the hell is really going on here?
The more likely they are to, the more educated, the more likely you are to be depressed. The more educated, the more likely you are to be depressed. And what is going on? I'm trying to think of if I have, some conclusion just based on speculation, but I really don't know why that could be. Let's check it out.
Here. The paper points out that it can be difficult to find good research on this, given the fact that social researchers lean liberal over conservative at a ratio of more than 10 to 1.
10 to 1? I knew there was a liberal bias, but 10 to 1? So don't anybody ever tell me that these things are unbiased or objective. We know that it's not. I didn't know it was that bad, but apparently.
Meaning these explanations of conservatives simply having unacknowledged privilege, lack of self-awareness, and lack of empathy tend to be the go-to explanation when observing this data, whereas little work focuses on how liberal ideology itself may contribute to unfortunate patterns of cognition or behavior or adverse state of affairs. Really gets the noggin jogging. Really makes you wonder if telling all those conservative kids not to go to university and not to get into social sciences wasn't the best idea, because it sure sounds like the world could use a few of them. Now, here's where things get a little spicy. The author highlights there's actually evidence that exists showing individuals' ideological and moral dispositions are biology-based and heritable to a significant degree.
So this says, it is possible that explaining the general link between liberalism and mental illness or disorders. It's possible that genetics and biology could explain much of the observed relationship between liberal identification and mental illness. After all, there is robust evidence that individuals' political, ideological, and moral dispositions are biology-based and heritable to a significant degree. And then they list a bunch of sources. One might hope that the cultural interventions, such as education, could help people transcend biological difference and approach common ground. However, the opposite seems to be true. Cognitive sophistication reinforces and exacerbates intrinsic differences rather than reducing them. Again, do with that what you will. I'm learning with you. That is crazy. 10-1, and this is all biology based.
According to the science, around 40% of your political ideology is heritable, which, if you subscribe to the classically liberal blank slate theory, has huge consequences to the entire operation of society as a whole, and especially the sphere I am in, politics. If this is true, then the approach of just trying to make as many logical arguments as possible to win over a political opponent seems like a bit of a waste of time. If this is biological and genetic rather than intellectual, especially considering the article highlights this. One might hope that cultural interventions such as education could help people transcend biological difference and approach common ground.
This is what we read before.
However, the opposite seems true. Cognitive sophistication reinforces and exacerbates intrinsic differences rather than reducing them. This is an idea I don't really want to accept or think about, but if I do, I reckon that this is actually extra true in a world like ours today, where we can find any sort of data or content we want online to
Google, why am I correct?
Reaffirm the things we already want to believe, and where any sort of disagreement is perceived as some sort of intrinsic moral threat to our lives and existence.
And guys, this is the whole purpose of this channel, is that discourse, specifically political discourse, has broken down. And we need to be able to fix that bridge where we can talk to each other. And I always talk about the two main factors. Look at that pause. Good face, Lauren. I always talk about semantic obfuscation and dogmatic thinking. Again, dogmatic thinking being accepting beliefs or ideas without the ability to question them, whether it's your religion or the idea that a male can transform into a female. That is dogmatic because it does not hold up to any evidence. Semantic obfuscation is using words, double speak. I've heard it in a number of different names, but I like semantic obfuscation because it is specifically what you're doing. You're taking words and you're obfuscating their meanings so that you can have kind of a dual meaning. So when you're in an argument, you can say the word racist and it works the way you want it to work. But then if somebody tries to throw that same thing back at you, well, I'm not racist because I'm black, so I can. Semantic obfuscation.
This is just what we see playing out in the world today, constantly. And of course, if being liberal is in fact a genetic predisposition, well, as the author states, it could be that the observed correlation between liberalism and mental illness is a product of some common set of biological or genetic factors that simultaneously predispose some people to both liberal worldviews and depression and anxiety, even as they dispose others towards conservatism and mental well-being. This stuff really isn't that far off from the theories of those like Jordan Peterson, who dedicates large portions of his work to analyzing the heritable personality traits of different political factions.
Shout out to
In
JBP.
fact, I think that's really what we're looking at here. Because what is politics if not an expression of how you approach the world? I don't think anyone believes that fetuses are slapped with a political party pin before they even pop out of their mother's womb. However, how much you value conscientiousness, security, conformity, openness, order, novelty, change, minimizing harm to others, fairness, and even how perceptible you are to feeling disgusted, all seem to have a basis in genetics. All of the traits that I just mentioned can be dramatically seen to be different in conservatives versus liberals. Now, Like most biological predispositions, they are in fact impacted, exacerbated, and muted to a degree by environmental factors. For instance, there is some evidence that children who are maladjusted, angry, aggressive, otherwise antisocial, are more likely to align themselves with left-wing parties as adults.
Who finds that surprising? Children who are maladjusted, angry, aggressive, or otherwise antisocial are more likely to align themselves with left-wing parties as adults. Why? Because it makes perfect sense. Conservatism is about decorum, about tradition, about all of that stuff. If you don't fit into that, then of course you're going to want that, who you are to follow just everything that I am is perfect. Instead of having the idea that, okay, we're all people, we're all different, but in order to have a functioning society where we can maximize the well-being for the most amount of people, I just want what's best for me. For me. Is that not liberalism in a nutshell? Come on.
Other studies have found that people who experienced abuse, insecurity, and trauma as children were much more likely to identify as liberal as adults. These populations are also especially likely to report mental illness as adults. Perhaps the greater question to ask here is not, are your political beliefs based on biology and genetics, but instead, are your political beliefs something that you can truly control? As regardless of whether you have, say, a higher sensitivity to injustice just because you have ADHD, which I just found out is apparently a real thing the other day.
Wow. The study is entitled Justice and Rejection, Sensitivity in Children and Adolescents with ADHD Symptoms. Science is a thing when you use it properly.
Or because you experienced extremely unfair situations as a child, the end result still seems to be the same. Lauren, you might say, what about the cases of conservative parents who have liberal children, or vice versa? Well, that's a very fair point. One obvious response to this is that perhaps those environmental factors outweighed the biological factors in that instance, which is entirely possible, but we've already addressed that. So I think the more interesting response is to point to the nuance that simply cannot be reflected in overall studies like this that divide everything into liberals do this and conservatives think that boxes. First of all, you and I both know there are far more different ideologies running about these days than left and right. What about libertarians or totalitarian communists? The
Shout out to the libertarians
of real life means that it is very hard to sort everything into a binary. Putting that aside for a moment, let's take a look at a hypothetical example of a parent and a child. Let's say that the parent is a boomer and they're very classically liberal, you could say, and their millennial child is based and red-pilled. Perhaps you could say on first glance, these two people that are related to one another have completely different views. But it's entirely possible, and in fact likely, as we've seen, that
I think if I'm understanding where she's coming from, is that despite the biological predispositions, that the environmental factors would outweigh that.
they actually share the same values and predispositions, although having lived through completely different political times, they express those values in different ways.
Ah, very interesting. Very, 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 very interesting. And that does make a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. What was liberal for boomers? What was liberal in I don't know, 1970 compared to where we are today? If you were a liberal in 1970, you're a far right Nazi alt-right, So that makes a lot of sense. Interesting.
Again, let's use that justice sensitivity example I mentioned earlier. If you grew up seeing Jim Crow laws in America, that could make you a very anti-racist liberal activist. But if you grew up seeing anti-white policies and you were in school being told you're horrible for being born with white skin, well, that could turn you into a bit of a reactionary.
So the concept is the same. Hey, those people are being treated unfairly, and I want to fight against that. But the people that are being treated unfairly in the different generations, in the different times, in the different places, very interesting.
Basically having the same reaction just to a different information input.
Right.
Of course, I'm simplifying it here, but it makes sense, doesn't it? To me,
Yup.
this seems like a neat explanation for those outliers you will inevitably come across. Now, as I mentioned at the start, all this stuff is just analyzing trends and theories, and there could always be factors we are missing. However, if this is true, and our political predispositions to be conservative or liberal are based strongly on things out of our control, including biology, and having intellectual discussions over it actually exacerbates our disagreements and pushes us further into our own ideological camps, that's quite a problem to have, isn't it?
Yeah, considering my whole goal is to have these conversations to bring us closer together. So, Lauren, tell me, how can I fix this?
And honestly, I've got to say, reality seems to line up with this theory quite well. I mean, when I was younger, people were far less politically engaged and they seemed a hell of a lot happier. And
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know if people were less politically engaged. It's that politics was less ubiquitous. Everything is politicized these days. Everything. You can't go anywhere without politics being shoved in your face, one side or the other. It used to be that politics was a thing that nobody really talked about. It used to be something that what were they, they always would say, when you're going out and meeting friends, you never talk about religion and politics. Because these were things that were personal. And unless it was directly relevant, people could watch a football game. People could go to a concert. People could, whatever activity you want to think of. They could do this without engaging in politics. And that's just not the case anymore.
more likely to accept political differences. And I
Right.
guess because the internet and social media had not grown to the level it has today, people were just less engaged on average. I'm not saying massive political division and growing extremism has not existed in history. Of course it has. But it has definitely been exacerbated by more people joining the online debate and
Wow.
engaging cognitively with these ideas.
So look at if we look at this this chart here, we're just looking at the differences, the overlap, and how different the parties are becoming. And you can see in '94 here, there was a little bit of a difference, but there was a lot of overlap. By 2004, not that bad. But again, fast forward 10 years, and now the overlap is way, way smaller than what's not overlap. The median has become much bigger, but that median, again, going back to the idea that people aren't necessarily less politically engaged, or people weren't less politically engaged. I think people today are, I guess that would mean, yeah, people are more politically engaged today because they have to be. Not necessarily because they want to be, but because they're forced to be.
We are certainly not coming together more. Now, why would it
Nope.
be that more education on politics and more engagement with the topics leads to more division and not, connection?
That's what I've been trying to figure out. Tell us, Lauren.
Well, one reason is when given plenty of time to theorize about these ideas, rather than learning with a blank slate, we have inherent biases we subconsciously try
That's
to affirm.
crazy.
And if we are highly intelligent, we can create all sorts of mental traps and structures to eternally self-affirm those ideas while infinitely demonizing our political enemies. You've got all of these structures on the left. Racism equals power plus prejudice.
Semantic obfuscation.
Don't tolerate the intolerant. All of these ideas that keep them locked into their own circle. I mean, even operating in the conservative sphere, I've had people frustrated with me for presenting factual information that contradicts the standard right-leaning narrative. And they'll say things like, well, Lauren, even if that is true, it doesn't help us reach the political goals that we're striving for. So it's better to just not highlight that information. Well,
I have no respect for people like that. If your message doesn't stand on its own merit and you need to put down other people's ideas just to bolster your own instead of presenting your ideas as inherently better, then you don't have that good of ideas. So to say that, something is true, something is real, but we're not going to talk about it because it doesn't help us, that sounds kind of bitch.
Well, that's just another wall we're building up to ensure there's no consideration of the other ideological side, and I don't like that. Really, the most important thing I took away from this work, though, is that the reality conservatives and liberals live in, the ways in which they engage with the world, may as well be entirely different realities.
They are entire different realities.
I think this is why the debate world is just entirely collapsed in itself, because we are not having intellectual disagreements. In some cases, we are processing information using entirely different parts of our minds, some more emotional, others more practical, more empathetic, others more critical and paranoid, and interpreting reality through the lens of our trauma, childhoods, and genetic predispositions. And when we do not take the emotional language of our political opponents into account, we don't just cease to communicate to them altogether, we actually reinforce their positions and paranoia. It's incredibly easy to communicate to people like you guys, who I tend to already agree with. We get along, you hear me out, you get the way that I present ideas, right?
Unless you don't agree with Lauren Southern, in which case, let me know if you think that is she going somewhere? Does she have a point here? There's a lot of information about where this could be, but it's not definitive. But it certainly is apparent that Republicans or conservatives tend to be happier than liberals. That doesn't answer the question of you should be this political ideology to make yourself happy. But it really does beg the question of why people are acting so differently. And maybe it answers the question of why people are acting so differently. Because even though we essentially all want the same things, we are viewing reality through two completely different types of lenses. So I don't know. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Once again, this is Morty, and I am your host, Lutch, aka the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. Check me out live every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Until then, guys, we are out of here. Make sure to check out that Discord. Peace.